that struck down President Donald Trump's trade tariffs. Speaking at the agricultural salon in Paris, Macron praised the importance of checks on power and the rule of law in democracies. He emphasized that having a Supreme Court ensures a balance of power. Macron also discussed the potential impact of Trump's new global 10% tariff, stating that France would consider the consequences and adapt accordingly. He stressed the importance of reciprocity in international trade, urging against unilateral decisions. France aims to continue exporting key products from agriculture to luxury goods. Listen in.
Je pense que ça invite tout le monde à réfléchir. Ça semble pas mal d'avoir des cours suprêmes et donc un état de droit. Tous ceux qui pensent que les cours suprêmes c'est des problèmes dans la vie politique, voilà, une cour suprême, elle a regardé la Constitution, elle dit c'est pas conforme à la Constitution. Là, tout le monde dit c'est formidable, ben voilà, c'est bien d'avoir des pouvoirs et des contre-pouvoirs dans des démocraties. Il ne faut pas aller trop vite non plus, parce que je constate que le président Trump, quelques heures, a dit qu'il avait repris des textes pour avoir de nouveaux tarifs, mais alors ceci plus limités et pour tout le monde. Donc on va regarder exactement les conséquences, ce qui peut être fait, et on va s'adapter. Au fond, nous, qu'est-ce qu'on veut?
This comes as the US Supreme Court's ruling striking down President Trump's tariffs has delivered a major setback, leading to new uncertainty in global trade. In response, Trump has imposed a 10% global tariff, continuing his aggressive trade policy despite the court's decision. The ruling raises questions about the validity of trade deals struck by his administration with countries worldwide, potentially reshaping global trade dynamics. We are now being joined by Vicky Pryce, who is a British economist and a former joint head of the United Kingdom's Government Economic Service, joining us from London. Thank you so much, Vicky Pryce, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what does the ruling of by the Supreme Court of the United States striking down sweeping tariffs tell us about the limits of executive authority in trade policy?
Well, it emphasizes that there are limits. It's interesting that this issue has been looked at for some time now. And so the US Trade Court had also ruled that those tariffs used in this particular way were also questionable. But of course, on appeal, what was happening is that those tariffs were still allowed to continue to be operating until a decision was made. And now we have the decision by the Supreme Court, which is basically saying that those tariffs were illegal under the US Constitution, in the sense that this particular measure, which is this emergency powers to impose tariffs because of trade concerns by much more than just trade concerns, or at least that's how the whole thing was presented by President Trump, were unconstitutional, and what you had to do was perhaps those powers, if they ever become available again, had to be approved by Congress. So the idea that tariffs against countries, for whatever reason, could just be applied by the president is now no longer valid in terms of general tariffs. But what is still valid is the ability to impose tariffs on particular sectors which are considered to be strategic and important for the US economy. So we're not away from tariffs altogether. And of course, as we know, what President Trump has now done, he's used a different section, I think it's section 122, under which he's able now to put a general tariff of 10% on everybody, but it has huge implications in the short term, and that's only for a period of time, of course, 150 days. It's huge implications for a number of countries which, despite having had negotiated their own tariffs down, are at present, or were at present, certainly it's happening now on September 24th, when those 10% tariffs will be applicable, have found themselves with tariffs which are considerably higher than 10%. So there will be a rethink of trade in between countries, without any doubt, companies will start asking for possibly some of the cash back that all those tariffs before were causing them to pay. And also, of course, consumers who had been arguably overcharged over a period illegally. So that's going to be quite a nightmare, actually, over the next few months.
And as you just said, that we know that Donald Trump announced a new 10% global tariff. Is this a strategic recalibration, or is it a political message aimed at his domestic voter base? And as you just said, within America, how might these renewed tariff measures affect American consumers already facing pressures?
It's a very good question, because it is indeed a political gesture to show that he still has power, and he's going to exercise that power, even though that 10%, as I said earlier, is limited for the moment to 150 days, and then he has to have congressional approval for that to be renewed. But indeed, there is no doubt that this has been a costly experiment for the US. If you look at calculations that have been made already, the suggestions are that over 2025, this increase in tariffs, which of course brought in something like $180 billion of revenue, extra revenue to the US Treasury, what the cost has been to consumers. The average household has been paying $1,000 more for the purchase of goods than would have been the case otherwise. And the expectation was that if this regime remained in 2026, despite the fact that there have been some reductions in some of those tariffs, the average cost would be $1,300 per household. And for mid-sized firms in particular, and there was a research paper produced quite recently by one of the investment banks, this has been a huge cost in the tens of millions of dollars for a number of firms that have been importing things, say, from China in the past for the supply chain, who have had to pay an awful lot more or switch to other suppliers which were perhaps more expensive than would otherwise have been the case. So yes, there's been a cost to the US economy, but what I think President Trump wants to show has been saying actually already since the Supreme Court announcement, is that he's going to make changes as much as he possibly can within his powers to ensure that what is collected remains as high as before, if not increases.
And as we heard, Emmanuel Macron said it is good to have counterweights to power in democracies. Is this ruling being viewed globally as a reaffirmation of institutional checks and balances in the United States?
Yes, I think it is viewed positively from that point of view. I mean, the interesting thing is that, of course, we all know that tariffs have been used partly to achieve different ends by President Trump, threats and sanctions against various countries which have seen, as a result, tariffs being imposed on them. So the interesting thing from other countries' viewpoint is that perhaps that type of pressure in the future will be less. But of course, what we had already seen, and it's interesting that you had President Macron's comments earlier, is that the EU itself had been looking at ways in which it can itself react to tariffs which it perceives to be coercive tariffs, to get them to do various things that perhaps they wouldn't want to do otherwise. And there is a special ability now, legislative ability within the EU to respond to such coercion. So if that coercion doesn't happen so much in the future because of the changes that perhaps will be implemented now in the US, then obviously the need for such measures will also be reduced. So we might move to a slightly more even, balanced approach to trade. But, you know, this is a very volatile environment, and everyone that I've been hearing in the last few hours commenting on this says that we just don't know where we'll end up.
And could these new tariff escalations reignite trade tensions, not just with China, but other allies in Europe and Asia, potentially reshaping global supply chains again?
We've already seen that happen, of course, to a very considerable extent. And again, just look at the US. If you look at the outflows of money, in other words, you know, where things have been bought by US producers, it's switched very, very significantly to places where perhaps some of those tariffs are not so great. So there has been a rebalancing happening. Whether it's to the best for economic growth is questionable, because obviously people were buying things from places which are cheaper or more productive, where perhaps the goods they were importing were better quality and so on. So in some ways that's negative for world growth. But if we move to a situation where at least tariffs, on general tariffs, not necessarily those for particular sectors, are equal across, more or less, let's say 10%, those who had negotiated something better will find that they are affected negatively. Those who negotiated something worse for them will perhaps see things improve. So from that point of view, we might actually see a little bit of return to a bit more balanced trade of the type we saw before, but there's already been such a change happening, a new supply chain routes having been developed, that you might find that that's actually difficult to come back. And then, of course, everyone will worry about what happens next. So maybe we're not going to see anything much happen in the short term while we're waiting to see whether things stabilize from that point of view.
And what signal does this back and forth between the executive branch and the judiciary send to global markets and trade partners about US policy predictability?
Well, that perhaps Congress will be more involved in the future on any decision that's made, and maybe executive powers will not be used so much. It remains to be seen. Of course, we are moving towards the midterm elections, and probably a lot of things will need to happen in between now and then in terms of however policy might be crystallized in various areas. So I think uncertainty is probably going to be still the name of the game, I am afraid. And also the chances of anyone getting any money back from having overpaid perhaps during a period of illegal, as they're now considered to be, tariffs, is probably going to be very long drawn and may actually not lead to anything very much at all.
And if tariffs become a central campaign issue, how might this reshape the debate between economic nationalism and free trade in US politics? And also, could this decision deepen economic divisions within the US?
Again, that's a very good question. Of course, we do know that a lot of the tariff policies, if we forget the ones which are used to achieve political aims, have been part of what had been promised by President Trump in his pre-election campaign, which is to bring manufacturing back to the US and improve manufacturing capability and employment in the US itself, because of what he perceived to be unfair competition from elsewhere. That obviously is a positive for quite a lot of people who voted for him. Now the question is whether these changes are going to make a huge amount of difference to his plans. So, but the fact that he has been defeated in an area which was supposed to have been, his center of power, if you like, or his show of power, it is possibly a sort of negative impact for President Trump. But I'm not a political commentator. What will happen to the economy? I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I think the costs have been significant for mid-sized firms. If there is a sigh of relief, we might actually see that the economy does a little bit better than would otherwise be the case, which will be a positive thing for him coming up to the midterm.
Thank you so much, Vicky Price, for joining us here today on NewsX. It was a pleasure.